and welcome to the Student Ministry Conversations podcast. This podcast is all about equipping, encouraging, and inspiring youth pastors weekly with topics that are brought to the table by youth pastors from all over the world. And now, here's your host for this week, David Pruitt.
Well, hello and welcome to the podcast. If this is your first time listening to us, we want to welcome you over and invite you to our website, www.studentministryconversations.org, where you can find all of our previous episodes, show notes, blog articles, and much, much more. Our goal here is that you are inspired, encouraged, and the things that you hear on this podcast would equip you to be a better student pastor for the church that you are serving in. All right, let's get into it. So today I am honored and excited to bring my buddy Tyler Looney back onto the podcast. The last time we did this, we were both in different roles in different towns, and it's incredible how God has brought us together. We'll talk a little bit about that, but let's just kick off. How are things since you are? Okay, let's start here. Tell us a little bit about yourself and kind of like what's happened since last time you were here.
Sure. So last time that I was on the podcast with you, David, I was serving in Lindale, Texas as an associate pastor there, and had been in that position for about 2 years. And this January I had the opportunity to answer a call to head back out west to Sweetwater, Texas, where I'm currently serving as the senior pastor. So in the last 6 months, I've had the fun transition of becoming a senior pastor, living into that, and living into the gifts and graces that my mom would tell you I've had since I was 7, and my wife would say she's seen in me all along, and certainly I'm seeing where God has that call in my life. And so been thrilled to serve here again for that long. And whenever I got here, one of the first things I was told is that I was going to be losing our youth pastor, and I was pretty bummed about that. And at the same time, it opened up a door to get you, David, here as our youth pastor, as well as / worship guy / media guy / jack of all trades, as I've been saying. And I think certainly we know, and I shared this last time on the podcast, that anytime you're serving in a church and serving in any ministry role, even as a volunteer, you're going to be filling multiple needs. You're called to kind of be a Swiss Army knife, but you certainly bring a lot of different gifts and graces to the table that I do not have, and so I'm glad that you're here with us. But yeah, doing good. The kids are, oldest daughter 16, and youngest daughter is going to be 11 here in August. So, and married almost 18 years this August as well. So life is good. God is good.
Yeah, for sure. It's been incredible how full circle things have gone. I think I talked about it the last time you were on, but we served together in Canyon for several years, and being able to come back together after all these years, and it's been kind of we still like each other after 10 years of growth. It's been really cool, and that was one of the things that we talked about at coffee this morning. Is you wonder like how much change has happened in both of us, and since I got married and had a kid, and your kids are now teenagers, and it's just kind of an incredible, really just incredible God's timing and all of this that we've been kind of pinching ourselves these last few weeks. But it's been really cool. And, in talking about that, one of the things that we found very quickly is that both of us, as much as we've grown, we still have certain things that we have always struggled with, even 10 years ago, that we're still struggling with, but maybe have a little bit more wisdom on how to handle those things. And so today's topic is talking about insecurity and kind of those feelings of inadequacy that I think a lot of us feel at different times. Sometimes it's more on the side of like imposter syndrome, feeling like no matter how good we are, or how equipped we are, or how called we are, we're just not the right person, whether it's in our position or at our church, or maybe it's outside or external pressures and different things like that. But that's one of the things that you and I have talked a lot about, even all those years ago in Canyon, Texas. But it's been kind of incredible to see some of the things that you've learned in your time, and some of the things that I've learned and I'm still trying to learn since then. And so really, at the end of the day, I think that ministry brings a whole lot of pressure to perform, honestly, at high levels. Sometimes it can feel impossible to meet all the expectations that
Mm-hmm.
are set for us, both by the church, by maybe our senior pastor, or even pressures that we put on ourselves. And so
Mm-hmm.
today, that's where I kind of wanted to start with us is how do you, Tyler, typically cope with those feelings of insecurity?
Well, I think the first thing is as far as your growth and how you move forward, a lot of it is just becoming more and more self-aware. And I think you kind of know those moments of insecurity, what are the triggers for those, right? And so you are able to prepare yourself more and more for those. I've recently been looking at hiking shoes. Let me just use this as an illustration. This is the pastor's way, right? But been looking at hiking shoes and thinking about the importance of having the most stable shoes possible because I know the stability. I know what I'm needing in those hiking shoes for myself, and I need that stability because of the uneven terrain I plan on hiking on here in September and in my trip. And I think that for yourself, you become more aware with your own mental state, your own cognitive, how you function, and what are those things that kind of cause you to be unstable, and making sure that you're equipped properly to handle those moments and you're self-aware, you kind of know. And certainly I recognize on a physical level my body and some of the issues I have with the left knee, and so I'm not as stable on that side, and so I know how to step properly too on those uneven surfaces. And I think the same thing for us as we navigate those insecurities and those feelings of inadequacy. We know what those triggers are, right? And so the self-awareness I've even come into to grasping and being okay with how I am when it comes to socializing with people, that I get a little bit of anxiety when I'm in, for instance, after church, and people want to come up and talk to me, and I have 10 or 15 people standing around and they want to visit for one reason or another. Prayerfully, they're wanting to say, hey, we really enjoyed the service today, but sometimes they want to gripe about the air conditioning, not here, but maybe they're wanting to gripe about something that didn't go well, or maybe they have something surface level to talk about, or maybe something really deep to talk about. And in those moments, I've discovered that I can become very uncomfortable socially. I struggle with that, and what happens is I know that's a trigger for me later on in the day to feel insecure and feel like, man, I didn't do a good job as a pastor. So I always prepare myself in those moments to go, okay, I know I might feel insecure. Maybe I didn't handle that well, or if I make a mistake in service, it's something that I feel like is big, but to everybody else is small. I prepare myself and know that, hey, I'm going to feel a little unstable and feel a little insecure in this moment, and how can I prepare myself? So I think a lot of it, kind of in a roundabout way, what I'm saying is that you're proactive and ready for those moments where you know that those feelings of insecurity are triggered. And the other factors that could play a role into that is if you're tired, if you're worn out, you know that you're probably going to struggle more with insecurity because you're tired, your brain's not functioning at a full capacity, right, full level, and so I need to make sure and get proper rest. But man, I think self-awareness is in that proactive, knowing how you function, how you tick, is one of the best things you can do for navigating those moments. And the other thing is too, and it's really important to note that those words of self-doubt, those negativities, those aren't from God. So knowing that some of those thoughts that are thrown in your mind, those are not from God, they're from the enemy. And so throwing them out of your brain as if they're garbage being given to you from the enemy.
For sure. It's so easy to I like that you talked about obviously knowing yourself, but also knowing when you're tired, that those are going to be
Mm-hmm.
moments, especially if you're someone who deals with insecurity on a more regular
Yeah.
basis. Understanding that when you're tired, it is very difficult to avoid those triggers because
Yeah.
you're not fully um, you're not fully aware. You're not fully
Yeah.
um, yeah. I don't exactly know what the term.
It's. I mean, it's even going back. It's even going back to that hiking illustration, David. What I was saying,
Mhm.
that when you're tired, even hiking, your stability, like that's more often when people roll and even break ankles when they're hiking on rocky terrain is because they're tired and they're worn out. So even more so when I'm tired, and hiking up in the mountains, in those moments, I'm even more self-aware and intentional about each step I take, because I know my body is worn out, and it's more likely that I'm going to take a wrong step and fall, and could hurt my ankle. And so I think when you're really tired, especially, you should be on guard mentally, emotionally, for those feelings of insecurity and inadequacy, and for any self-doubt and negativity of any kind. But it's, again, that self-awareness. Can you be realistic enough with yourself? Like, man, I'm worn out, and so I know I'm a vulnerable target right now for the enemy.
For sure. And I would also throw in there, in those moments, it's really important to have a good circle of friends around you, that because sometimes we can get so hyper focused on what we have going on or what we have ahead that we'll totally miss the fact that we're exhausted. And sometimes you just need that friend who loves you enough to say, dude, go take the rest of the afternoon. You need some rest. Or, as funny as it is to say, I feel like Snickers has really like hit not only on a good market, but something true. It's like, you're not you when you're tired. Dude, go eat a Snickers. Like, you need some food, bro. Like, you're acting like Betty White out there. But I think there's something to be said about that, having a good group of people, not just people that will tell you what you want to hear, but will be honest with you and say, hey, you really need to take a second. And so that's part of the reason why I wanted to have that conversation with you, is because this is something that you and I are talking a lot about as I'm coming out of a season of working too much, too hard, and you being honest with me and saying, hey, you really need to take more days off and vacation and stuff.
And I just want to
I'm
say
learning.
real quick too, and I'm glad you're doing that. And I just want to say too, real quick, it's really important for people to recognize too that sometimes if you're not careful, those friendships too in the insecurity realm, if you're constantly fishing and needing affirmation from those people, those can form really quickly into codependent relationships and become burdensome. And so it's really important that those relationships do not turn into that codependency in a place where you're seeking that affirmation, but rather a place where those people will encourage you and lift you up, and just point out to you like, hey man, you need to live in truth.
Yeah, that's huge, and I'm glad you said that too. That can creep up on you without you even realizing it's happening.
Yeah.
Absolutely. So, well, let's keep going. Let me ask you this way. Do you mind describing, if you can think of a particular time when you felt like super insecure, and how you began to deal with it? Did you deal with it healthily? Did you not?
Sure. I mean, even going just to the most recent, this past Sunday, and a moment where my brain was focused on, is our live stream working properly, and my brain's focused on is everything in order. And right before I get up to preach, I looked over, and this has not happened to me before, but I look over in the communion elements. Typically I wait until right before service starts to take the Hawaiian, because we use the holy Hawaiian bread, right, for our communion, for our bread. And I had it in the wrapper still, and it was underneath the cloth, and you could see the orange bag sticking out. And then turn around and remembering, I have the gluten-free bread that's in the Ziploc bag that I haven't set out, and thinking, man, I completely failed to put those out. And in that moment, while we had one of our lay speakers up there praying and reading scripture, I mean, I had just this overwhelming feeling of like, I've totally messed up and I'm totally no good, and all these negative thoughts come into my mind. And I think, again, that self-awareness and being okay with making mistakes, and being okay with not looking perfect. And I think, man, we live in such a performance-based culture, and we live in such a, the selfie culture. I feel like it's slowly, like, people are starting to get that authenticity and genuineness is more important. But we still live in somewhat of a culture where it's all about that image and how good you look. And so people, getting the selfies and, I'm going to get the filter on there to look right. And I think what I've discovered is that really for me in those moments, where again I felt insecure this Sunday. It kind of made me feel, I just kind of called it out, and I just kind of said, hey, this bothers me, but it happens, it's part of life. And just kind of own it, embrace the awkwardness in the moment. And really, David, again, I've shared with you several times, and I've shared with our church that importance of taking a step back. And we could talk more about this, I think, as we go in our conversation, but that importance in that moment, take a step back and look at the grand scheme of things. Like, does that ultimately change what we're here for? It's for Jesus. And being able to move forward, just address it, hey, I failed to do this, and kind of making a laugh out of it, fix it, and then move on. And in that moment when I step back, I always try to take in a deep breath and let it out. And I try to, in that moment, ground myself in who I am in Christ Jesus, and not worry about any of those feelings that I'm having. Realize that feelings don't dictate who I am, but rather Christ dictates who I am. And I probably could have just said it that simply. Take a step back, and don't let my feelings navigate and dictate who I am, but let Christ navigate and dictate who I am. So,
for sure. And that's, I think sometimes that's the hardest part of all of it, is when you get so wrapped up in feeling like you've totally failed, and you allow all, we say this all the time as pastors to our students, but sometimes it can be really difficult for us to remember all the things that we know when when the light is shining on us in those moments of insecurity, that it's not only okay to fail. You've got to silence those voices, and the only way to do that is to take a step back and realize that it's going to be okay. It's going to be okay.
And again, remember those negative thoughts. I mean, there's such a thing as the Holy Spirit's conviction, and there's proper correction. But again, when you take something that's the difference is, right, something that's self-destructive, and a lot of times those insecurity and insecure thoughts and those thoughts of inadequacy, those are not, again, from God. They're from the enemy, and I think you have to remember, that's not my thought. I don't want it to be kind of like he's handing you a piece of trash, and you're like, gross, you need to throw it off to the side and move on.
For sure. Have you ever felt like the insecurities that you're dealing with? I mean, sometimes those insecurities can be something as silly as, oh, I forgot to unwrap the communion bread, which may not seem like a big deal, but when we're talking about consecrating something as a holy meal, it's like we want it to be presented the right way, and we don't want, let's be honest, it's a traditional element. And so the first thought, at least in my mind, that comes up is like, oh man, I'm about to upset a really old person. And those are the ones that tend to, or at least in my experience, those are the ones that tend to make the biggest fuss, I guess, in those situations.
That might be an assumption.
We're gonna go there in just a little bit. But have you ever found that those insecurities impact the way, let's say it this way, impact like not only your relationships with, say, like your family and your church, but also the way that others perceive you?
Well, 110%, because when you're being insecure, what insecurity is thinking that you can somehow do something to prove yourself, and insecurity is a moment where you're fixated and focused on yourself. It takes all the attention away from what God wants you to focus on, and puts it squarely on your own shoulders and on yourself. And so people very clearly see that. In fact, I think that's probably, and I've said this before, this is an assumption I have, is that the majority of senior pastors tend to be, they lean into that narcissism, and probably a lot of that is from a place of insecurity. But insecurity is, again, fixating yourself on yourself. You're focused on yourself rather than on what God has for you, and what He calls for you to do. And I think people see that. I think, you could talk about us as adults, but certainly as a teenager, insecure teenagers. I mean, think about the conversation. I'm not pretty enough. I'm not this. I'm not that. I'm not this. And then there's even jealousy over, well, they got this award and I didn't get it, and I'm no good. And then I guess I can reflect on that moment specifically as a father, even with my daughter. And I know she's never going to watch this podcast, so I'll share it. But I remember being at an award assembly not too long ago, and they're giving these awards to these kids left and right. And my daughter, when we were leaving, she was just so upset. And I said, "Why are you upset?" She's like, "I didn't get any award and I'm no good. And which she did get an award, was the funny thing, but she didn't get the award she was hoping she would get. And our comment to her was, "Wow, why don't you, instead of being, focused on yourself and on your being disappointed and that insecurity that's wrapped up in that, why don't you focus on celebrating the other person getting that award and be excited for them?" And so I think it's the same thing for us. When you're insecure, you're thinking about yourself. You're not thinking about other people and about what God has for you.
And I think that's probably the root of it. So many times, at least for me, when I consider what's wrong, so to speak, the thing that I always try to go to is like, what's the root cause of this problem? And I think that's what it really comes down to more than anything. And the funny thing about insecurity, and even they're not exactly the same thing, but I think both of them kind of coming from the same spot of like, I think for me, sometimes I play insecurity off as being like trying to be humble. Yeah, exactly that. And I'll never forget my buddy Levi McKay. Levi really well.
Mm-hmm.
He once told me that humility oftentimes comes from a place of pride. And I even remember, and I think you and I have talked about this too, even way back in the day, that there were so many times that I legit thought I was taking a posture of humility, and it was like, and so I would like bash myself, and I can't exactly remember how Levi said it, or even you have said it in the past, but I do remember saying something, and I was like, well, I don't want to make it about me, or something in that line, and Levi's like, dude, that's pride. In my mind, I was like, no, pride is cocky, pride is arrogant, and he was like, humility, it all goes back to pride. Whether you're super, super arrogant on one side or super, super humble on the other side, it's all rooted in pride. And I think sometimes it comes down to our pride so easily gets hurt. Whether it's because we wanted that award and we didn't get it, or we wanted that recognition. Sometimes it might be a situation where you put together an event and you work really, really hard on the event, and it doesn't go the way that you wanted to go, or you thought it went really, really well, but your senior pastor was like, that was a total flop. And it's hard not to go, but what do you mean it was a flop? Like, I worked really, really hard on that, and all of my metrics were filled, but maybe the church had different goals, or maybe it didn't quite fit the mission statement the way, or the mission and vision of where you as a senior pastor is trying to lead the church, which we all know is God's spirit moving. But at the same time, like, sometimes we can do all the things, and it could be a successful event, but unfortunately you spent a little bit more money than you should have. And so we have to have a conversation about that, and it can ultimately hurt our pride. And then we can get super insecure because of that.
And so a couple things. So you said just a little bit ago, you were talking about the root of that, right? And the root of that insecurity is, again, you're putting your identity into something else besides Christ, and that's idolatry. And so I would say that you need to make sure that you're putting your roots, as Colossians 3 says, putting your roots into Jesus rather than into yourself and somehow your performance. And with that being said, too, when you're talking about, like, because so often when your first response is an insecure response or a what did I do wrong response, then sometimes that conversation with the senior pastor, you could be talking with your supervisor, or talking with a parent or whoever it is in an event you did, and maybe you had an amazing youth ministry event. Let's say you went on a mission trip. It was phenomenal, but you went over budget. And you come into the pastor's office, or you talk with the finance committee or somebody, and they're like, hey, we're thankful you went on this mission trip, you did this, but you went over budget. And sometimes that insecure mind is just going to hear the negative and not hear the positive. And sometimes that correction is not a bad thing. Correction should never invoke insecurity. In fact, I would say that if you are a mature, confident believer, then you should view correction in moments like that adversity, is opportunities to grow, right?
Yeah.
Opportunities to learn more and more about yourself and how God has wired you and where God is calling you and how He's going to use you. And I think it's really easy for us to go to that whipping ourselves when someone just speaks a little bit of correction. And so I think people should get more comfortable. And this is where I love sports. I love the idea of putting yourself in places of discomfort. So now, because I don't do competitive sports, because I'm almost, I'm an old man, that I love going to the gym and feeling uncomfortable. Or I love going up in the mountains and feeling uncomfortable. Those, like, getting comfortable with being uncomfortable, because those are, again, moments to be stretched and to be grown. And I think we need to be better mentally as pastors at feeling uncomfortable and be okay with that. And when someone comes in, again, prepare yourself. I've had someone recently come in my office, 2-3 weeks ago to speak some correction to me, and being prepared. I'm self-aware enough too to go, hey, they're probably going to say something that might make me feel a little uncomfortable, and I might want to go insecure with it. But Lord, would I please take and use whatever they say? Help me grow from this, because my security is placed in you, not in what I've done right or wrong. So yeah, because I guess you might be able to say an insecure person, their security is placed in all the stuff they think they do wrong, and an arrogant person, their security is placed in all they think they do right.
That's a good way to put it. It's a really good way to put it.
I don't know.
And I think sometimes we find, I would venture to guess that most of us are probably somewhere in the middle, depending on the situation. Sometimes we feel really confident in our abilities for certain things, and a lot of times that comes down to perceived success, whether that's our own success or people telling us that, hey, you're really succeeding in this area. And so we can feel a little bit more confident, and it can be a little bit of a harder crash when we don't do so well. I know for me, in particular, one of the big things for me is like, we could have a really, really good week, and we have lots of students show up, and it just feels like, those youth nights when it just, everything went right, and you felt like the students just really got it. And then the next week it's like somebody slashed all 4 of your tires, and you're just like, what? Like, what happened? Why didn't we had so much momentum and hope, and then the very next week it was just like, it just totally fell flat. And it may not have anything to do with anything that you did. Like, you may still be preaching the same that you would normally do, and you had the same amount of students, and sometimes just, you get them on the right week. And so that can be really hard.
And maybe we should be more comfortable with putting ourselves in places where we're stretched in that, and where we have to be more secure in who we are in Christ. Because I think we love to find, you were talking about your gifts and graces, like, well, I'm more secure when I do this. And certainly I think depending on the context, right, this is where I'm secure. Well, maybe find some places that are going to stretch you in that, so that you can grow and put your security more and more in Christ rather than in yourself. And I'm not a Calvinist by any means, but maybe God allows for us to have moments where we have low attendance, so that our dependency is not in the attendance and what we think and perceive as success, but rather we are finding our success in Him and who He's said we are and what He calls to be success. So
I mean, there are certainly times where I think we need a little humility. For sure.
And again, I'm not trying to be like God's smiting people or anything like that, but I do think that God allows us to go through moments to kind of learn and grow and see that, hey, buddy, you're not supposed to be dependent upon that. That's not where you find your security, but it's in me.
Yeah, for sure.
And again, that's a cultural thing. I think numbers. Any youth directors, youth pastors that are listening right now, I tell you, stop. If you've got a pastor who's putting that stress and pressure on you about your numbers and your attendance, I'm sorry that you're going through that, but I think it's really important to ask yourself the question of how does God perceive success for that ministry? What is God calling for that to be? And if it's for your youth ministry to have 1,000 kids, then fantastic. But I think that spiritual growth in your kids. We can get so focused again on the wrong things, chasing the carrot, as I would put it.
Yeah.
And instead, we need to be pursuing what God calls success. So there's more small youth ministries than there are large youth ministries. Just saying. So
Yeah, and it's funny how we lose sight of what's most important, thing. And I've talked a lot about this in the last several podcasts, and I feel like God just continues to keep it right on the forefront of my thoughts and my heart. But we've spent so much time planning and doing and begging God to meet us where we are, and I feel like there needs to be a cultural shift where we stop asking God to bless our ministries and our work and our hands and start saying, God, where are you? Where are you moving? What do you want to do? And let me go to where you are. Let me lead our people to where you are. And very much like a sort of a Moses situation um, in the wilderness,
following the pillar of cloud and fire.
exactly. We just
Yeah.
gotta stop asking God to just give us all the things, give us more people, give us more, and it's nice, I certainly think that it's important for us to ask
Pursue
God.
excellence. I
Yeah,
think we should be
pursue
pursuing
excellence. Yeah.
excellence, and I think pursuing. I mean, I'm not going to be like, oh, woe is. Again, there's a balance on there, but it's ultimately where are you finding your security and your identity in Christ, and then ultimately what is His call, and if He's called you to be where you're at with a ministry that's 1,000 people, or if it's a ministry that's 2 people. But being there and serving, and if it grows and multiplies, fantastic. Or if it starts to decline, then fantastic. Just be where God calls you to be. But again, that's that performance-based culture we live in, where people are going, well, your numbers aren't up, and so you may not get to keep your job there, but just serve faithfully until you feel like God's called you away. And I can't help but think about the people who have served in ministries where maybe they poured into youth students, for these 5 youth students for 2 years, and the pastor or the personnel committee of the church, they finally had enough. Well, we wanted that youth ministry to be 50 kids, not 5 kids, and so we're letting you go. But thinking like those 5 kids that youth pastor poured into for those 2 years, like what impact is one of those 5 kids or all 5 of those kids going to have on the world? And
Yep.
we forget that, man, again, Jesus, I mean, how many people were with Christ, right? The closest disciples there, so, and 12, and 1 betrayed, and so I would just encourage people to ask the bigger question of what is God calling me to, and what does success look like in His eyes? So.
For sure. Last thing I wanted to talk a little bit about, and you preached this a few weeks ago, and we kind of alluded to it earlier, but it's this idea of leaning into assumptions versus reality. Do you mind talking a little bit about that? I think there's a lot of wisdom there.
And I think it ties into insecurities, right? Because a lot of times in moments where we make mistakes, we have assumptions. What are people thinking about us in that moment, right? And what we assume somebody's thinking may not at all be the reality. Married couples tend to navigate this a lot. In fact, I grabbed a book off my shelf, David, because I think everyone who tunes in should definitely check out Boundaries by Cloud and Townsend. I think it's a phenomenal book for people to
We'll
go
have
through.
that in the show notes for you guys.
Yeah, and I think that's something that if you wanted to invest in yourself, and then there's boundaries in marriage, and then there's boundaries with kids, but I think that's a great investment for just your own well-being. If you struggle with insecurity, if you struggle with relationships, if you just struggle mentally, I think it's a great book to dig into. But in there, there's lots of understanding as you read and navigate through that book with boundaries. There's a need for us as pastors and as people, just in general, that we take hold and captive of our thoughts, and that we stop living into, again, assumptions and live into the realities. And maybe a great illustration for this too is to imagine when you're driving your car and you have somebody cut you off, which I'm sure we've all been in this position, but somebody's cut you off. Well, in that moment, your flesh, your assumption is, well, that person cut me off and they're a jerk and they don't even care, and how inconsiderate and rude. And I guarantee you 9 times out of 10, the reality is that person didn't even know they cut you off. They had no clue. And so I think we tend to do that a lot. In general, we jump to conclusions before really knowing the full picture. And so this is that illustration I've used in sermons, and I've said to several folks, and I'm always reminded of when you play softball or baseball and you're in the outfield. One of the things they tell you, if a fly ball is hitting your direction, the very first step you take is not forward, but it's to take a step backward. So your first step is backwards, and then it gives you the ability to assess the situation and gauge where is that ball going to land, what's going to happen. The problem if you do the opposite, if your first step is forward, then the ball is going to go over your head 9 times out of 10. That's how that sport works. And so you have to learn to take that step back and then gauge the situation. And so whenever we live into assumptions, it's that charging forward without actually observing and looking at the situation. And so we want to take that and live into the reality. Well, what's the reality? So I'm going to take a step back. What's the reality? And even if somebody's being ugly to you, like maybe you're having a conversation with someone and they're just straight up being rude to you, well, the assumption is this person just hates me and all this, but maybe it's more important for you to take a step back in that moment and look at the reality and go, I'm not entirely sure what's at the root of why this person's being so ugly to me. Maybe they've had a really rough day. Maybe it doesn't have anything to do with me. Maybe it has something to do with a completely different person. And I think that also keeps you from, again, that insecurity. It empowers you, right? The boundaries thing. It helps you to, you're maintaining your own boundaries. You're maintaining control of yourself. You're taking captive of your own thoughts in that moment. And you're not going to let that situation or that person dictate how you feel about you, what you think about yourself, or what you think in general. And so I'm a firm believer that we, especially as pastors, we have to be people who live in the reality rather than assumptions. I cannot tell you how many times in the 18 years of ministry and all the different times I've had the opportunity to teach and preach, I cannot tell you how many times I have looked out to the audience that I'm preaching to, and I've seen a look on a person's face, and I assumed that either A, they were angry or disagreed heavily with what I thought, or maybe B, they were bored with it, or C, fill in the blank, whatever it is. I've had that happen so many times, and I've had to learn to not assume what a person, like, I don't know what they're thinking. And the reality may be that they don't like what I'm preaching, but until they express it and say it, I don't know. And so it's one of those. In fact, I've had a moment before where I thought a person did not like, and I'm one of these people that I have a resting angry face, I've been told. I tend to kind of have a natural kind of a scowl on my face. And I've had a lot of people assume things about me in a moment. I'm like, no, like I'm just thinking, just processing. And so, again, it's important that we do the same with others, that we don't assume things about people, but we look at the reality. And I think a lot of people in ministry, we tend to be, I think we're all kind of wired similarly, right? We're wired to be more passionate, people to be compassionate, and we tend to be a little bit more sensitive. And I think because of that, a lot of times we as pastors tend to jump to conclusions. We tend to assume things rather than live in the reality. And that's one thing I would tell anybody, again, learn to make that first step back, make that just a priority in your life. First step is going to be back. What's the reality of the situation? And don't live into assumptions. And until something is directly communicated to you, it's not a reality. And I would also say, those of you who are married, apply that to your marriage, because it's not fair to put that on your spouse and assume that they're thinking something when the reality is they've never even said that thing.
Yeah, incredible resource. Well, thank you guys seriously so much for listening. We would be so honored if you would share our podcast with your youth pastor friends on social media, or tag a specific episode that really stood out to you on your favorite platform by using @TalkStudentMen. Finally, if you would like to be on the show in the future, please reach out to us on social media or send us an email to podcast@studentministryconversations.org, and we would love to set up a time for you to join us. And I'll also throw this out there in the show notes. I'll have my email
address on there, so that if you need to reach out to me or you would like to reach out to Brandon, I can get you guys in contact. Until next week, we hope that you guys have a really, really great week, and we'll catch you guys on the next episode. Thank you, guys.